This week's Parsha is Parsha Tetzaveh, which is the 20th Parsha of the Torah, and it is the 8th chapter, Torah portion, in the book of Shemot. And in this week's Parsha, we get to talk about something that I love to talk about, which is clothing. Not general clothing, but in the context of this week's Parsha, we're talking about the clothing of the Kohanim. The Kohanim were the priests, the people who did temple service when we had the temple. And in this week's Parsha, what we're talking about in terms of Kohanim are the priests who did the temple service, but while we were in the tabernacle, while we were in the Mishkan, while we were in the desert. And we talked about in last week's video the construction of the Mishkan and all the different elements that went into it and how each one had a purpose, and it's pretty similar with the garments of the Kohanim. There were 8 garments that they had to wear in order to do the service, and they couldn't do their service without wearing all 8 garments. So God tells Moses that he needs to make these garments for Aaron, his brother, who was the first Kohen Gadol, or high priest, sort of the priest who was in charge of the most sacred services and also in charge of the other Kohanim. Now, there are, again, 8 pieces of clothing, and I'm just going to look at my list because I don't want to forget any of them. So we have some different pieces. One that is really interesting is the choshen, or the breastplate. Now, the Kohen wore across his chest a gold plate that had 12 gemstones, each one a different color, and each one representing a different tribe of the 12 tribes. And it was interesting because when the Kohen would have a question, he would ask God, and God would sort of respond to him through the breastplate by sort of lighting up one of the gemstones if it was about a specific tribe. Also contained inside of the choshen there was sort of a flap, and inside of this flap was a scroll that had the divine name, which is God's name. It's 22 letters long, and he would keep that inside of the breastplate as well. Now, continuing, there was 2 headpieces. There was a turban that he wore on top of his head, and additionally, there was a gold crown that he wore across his forehead. And inscribed in the gold was "Holy to Hashem." And he had to wear this headpiece at all times, it says, which I thought was really interesting as well. Sort of, nowadays Jewish men usually will cover their head if they're observant, maybe with a baseball cap, maybe with a kippah or a black hat, or they'll cover their heads in some way as a reminder that God is above and he is sort of looking on our actions and the way we conduct ourselves. So I thought it was kind of interesting to think about that the Kohen Gadol, or the Kohanim in general, wore something on their heads as well. Continuing down, there were different pieces that he wore of clothing on his body. We have a cloak or a robe, we have an apron, and we have a tunic. The apron was made of a beautiful, beautiful mixture of wools, a mixture of blue, purple, and red wool. It was made also with linen, and it was made with gold thread. So very luxurious, very beautiful, very intricate, and certainly something that would be hard to miss seeing. I'm sure if you saw the Kohen walking down the street, it would be hard to miss him. But if you did miss him walking with all these beautiful bright colors, when you saw what was on the bottom of his robe, you definitely can't miss that. On the bottom of the robe was made of turquoise, and on the bottom of the robe, on the hem, were 72 bells and 72 pomegranates, sort of making a trim around the hem of the robe. And it's really interesting, whenever he would walk through the town, obviously everybody would know he was coming. Everybody would be able to hear him and see him and recognize him. He was not somebody that you could avoid or just happen not to see. He definitely made a statement and an entrance, and people saw him. The tunic was a full-length garment, and it had sort of a box-like pattern. And then the other pieces we had a sash across the waist of the Kohen that would keep all the garments together, and then he also wore undergarments out of respect and modesty for the service that he was doing. So those are the 8 pieces that the Kohanim wore, and they wore these garments to set themselves apart from the general population. Again, we sort of talked about these bright, brilliant colors, and we talked about the sounds of the bells that the Kohen, the bells would sound when the Kohen was walking. And all of these things, they're not accidental. Definitely the Kohanim were supposed to set themselves apart from the crowd. You shouldn't be able to miss him. When you see him walking down the street, you should know who it is. You should know that he's a representative of Hashem, that he's doing God's work in the temple service, that this is like a holy person, that the way he's dressed on the outside is a reflection of his holiness internally as well. And what's interesting is when we look, sort of bringing it back to modern times, when we look at somebody crossing the street, or when we see other people in general, we do make assumptions about them. Whether it's the right thing to do or not, I don't know, but we definitely make assumptions about people based off of what they're wearing. If you see somebody, if you see a lady with leggings and a tank top and a baseball cap and tennis shoes, you might think, oh, okay, like she's athletic, she lives a healthy lifestyle, she's very interested in exercise and fitness. And if you see somebody with a white lab coat and a stethoscope, you say, oh, they're a doctor. That's what they do as their profession. If you see somebody who, has a fedora and neutral colors, you might say, oh, they are very bohemian. They like to live a bohemian lifestyle. We definitely make assumptions and presumptions about people based off of their appearance, based off of the way they dress, based off the way they conduct themselves. It's a reflection of their lifestyle and who they are as a person. So when we address ourselves, we have to think about, like, what is the message that I'm sending to other people by my clothing? Are they understanding who I am as a person and the essence of my being based off of my clothing? Is it a proper representation? If you're not sure, you can ask family or friends. You can ask them, like, does the way I dress, is it a proper reflection of who I am? When you see my clothing, do you see me? Do you see who I am? Do you see my values and the things that are important to me? When people talk about modesty, often they in Judaism at least, they think about the woman, and the woman has to cover this part of her body and this part of her body, and then she's going to be modest, and then she's going to be dressing herself in a modest way. But modesty is in a sense about covering parts of yourself, but it's not in other ways, and I'll explain. Modesty is really about sort of self-respect and self-value and sort of covering things that are important to you and sharing only with others what you want to share with them. There's a verse in the book of Micah that I like for many reasons. I'm going to read it to you. It says that Hashem tells you, man, what he requires of you. And so this is what God requires of you. To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk modestly with your God. Now, modestly, I've seen translations that says to walk humbly with your God, to walk modestly with your God, but they kind of have a similar meaning in the sense of being a modest person. It's not only about the clothing, but it's about humility. It's about not showing off to other people. It's about sort of knowing what you have and being okay that you know what you have and that not everybody else has to know what it is that you have, what things are that are special about you. But I think what we can really learn from the Kohanim, what we can really see from this week's Parsha, is that people do make assumptions about us based off of our appearances. And the Kohanim, when people saw the Kohanim, again, they saw this luxury and they saw this holiness and they saw this person that nobody else dressed like these people. These people were dressed in a very specific manner, in a specific way that when you saw them, you knew what they did. Just like the same way that I said, if you see a doctor with a stethoscope and his white lab coat, like, that's a doctor. So I would just encourage us to look at our clothing, to look at our wardrobes, and to see if they're accurate, if our clothing are accurate representations of who we are. And if not, maybe we make a change, and maybe not. But it's definitely something interesting to do. So I wish all of you a wonderful week ahead and a Shabbat Shalom.